But you were 13. What were you
I
seeing?
went there to see the lifestyle,
Right.
And I saw it, and it was. But I don't know if I could indulge and understand what I was even looking at.
Sean Diddy Combs isn't just a titan in the music industry. He's also seen as a mentor. The Grammy-winning rapper has taken several artists under his wing at a very young age, who later rocketed to stardom. But as he sits behind bars, those relationships are being scrutinized.
Pressure doesn't build overnight. It accumulates quietly, layer by layer, until one moment shifts everything. That's what this feels like. Not a sudden explosion, but a long-delayed reaction finally reaching the surface.
Yeah, so let's talk about Usher, because that is the name that he's known by worldwide. But he was born Usher Raymond IV in Dallas, Texas, back in 1978. The family moved to Atlanta, Georgia when Usher was a teenager, and you might recall this. He appeared on the televised talent show Star Search when he was 13 years old. Fun fact about that, he actually set the record for the longest note ever held by a child on Star Search, 12 seconds. So what happened? That got the attention of famed producer L.A. Reid. But according to his coaches, reportedly during puberty, when Usher's voice started to change, he kind of had trouble controlling his vocals. Now, L.A. Reid reportedly considered dropping Usher from his label, but when Usher begged him to stay on, Reid sent him to live with Sean Combs in New York for a year to train. And at the time, Combs, who was then known as Puff Daddy, we believe was in his 20s, there were these apparent training sessions, and these training sessions were known as Puffy Flavor Camp. Now, through the years, Usher has spoken about this time in his life with Combs. For example, in 2004, Usher told Rolling Stone that Combs introduced him to essentially sex. He said, quote, "Sex is so hot in the industry, man. There was always girls around. You'd open a door and see somebody doing it or several people in a room having an orgy. You never knew what was going to happen." On the Howard Stern Show in 2016, Usher talked about his time with Combs too, saying there was definitely a lot of wild partying, but he doesn't think he was really able to understand what all was going on. And when Howard Stern asked him, would you send your own kids to something like Puffy Flavor Camp, this is what he had to say.
What a life.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
14 years old. You're a dad now. Would you ever send your kid to Puffy Camp?
Hell no.
See?
Usher also spoke with People magazine back in February, saying some of the most valuable lessons I could ever learn as an entrepreneur were picked up when I spent that time in New York with him. This unwavering desire to create and make certain that your creative ideas are executed. I saw him in real time working it out, him building something from nothing, him understanding how culture and collaboration can build careers. Being able to see that, that's what I got. Now remember, Usher was 13 to 14 years old at the time. Combs reportedly had legal guardianship over Usher during that period. Can't confirm that for sure. And since his time with Combs, Usher has worked with several other producers and record labels, and he's become one of the top-selling R&B artists of all time. His awards and nominations are almost too many to count. He's won 8 Grammy Awards, 18 Billboard Music Awards. He's been inducted into the Georgia Music Hall of Fame, star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Rolling Stone magazine recently named the album Confessions Part 2 as the #1 greatest R&B song of the 21st century. The magazine also ranked the song's music video among its 30 sexiest music videos of all time, and VH1 wrote that he was the best dancer in pop since Michael Jackson. And of course, Usher recently performed last year at the Super Bowl halftime show. So he's not just any musical artist. He is a superstar who, you gotta say, his success has been at least partially attributed to his time spent with Sean Combs. The two have been photographed together at different events throughout the years. You can see that connection. But having said that, Usher has been quite silent on his former mentor's very public arrest and indictment. Combs was arrested on September 16th after a Southern District of New York grand jury indicted him on charges of racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking, transportation to engage in prostitution. The indictment reads, the defendant abused, threatened, and coerced women and others around him to fulfill his sexual desires, protect his reputation, and conceal his conduct. To do so,
The situation escalated fast because the stories didn't come from the outside. They didn't come from distant observers or secondhand whispers. They reportedly came from someone who was there early, someone who saw the inner workings before the image hardened into legend. That's why the fire feels so intense. When chilling allegations surface from someone who once stood close to power, the focus changes immediately. The conversation stops being about rumors and starts being about environments, about dynamics, About what happens behind closed doors when influence goes unchecked and silence becomes the price of survival. The public persona had always been built on control, confidence, authority, a sense that everything was deliberate and handled. People trusted that image because it felt immovable. It felt like certainty. But certainty is fragile when hidden stories begin to surface. What made these allegations chilling wasn't graphic detail or dramatic delivery. It was the emotional temperature, calm, controlled, almost detached in places. That tone doesn't come from exaggeration. It comes from processing something over a long period of time. Fear that lingers eventually changes shape.
Combs relied on the employees, resources, and influence of the multifaceted business empire that he led and controlled, creating a criminal enterprise whose members and associates engaged in and attempted to engage in, among other crimes, sex trafficking, forced labor, kidnapping, arson, bribery, and obstruction of justice. The allegations come after Combs' mansions in Miami and Los Angeles were raided by federal agents. Multiple victims, both men and women, have filed sexual assault, sexual harassment, sex trafficking lawsuits against Combs. One of the allegations is that he forced individuals to take drugs and participate in sexual performances known as freak-offs and to keep quiet about all of this. Now, Combs and his attorneys have denied that he did anything wrong mentioned in this criminal indictment against Combs. Okay, want to be very clear about that. And he has not been accused of wrongdoing by authorities in any way. Having said that, many people are wondering what he might have seen at a young age when he lived with Combs in the 90s. This is a very common topic of conversation right now. Deep dives into the people surrounding Combs. Justin Bieber, Jennifer Lopez, Usher, so forth. What do they know? Will they be a part of any kind of case? Now, days before Combs was arrested, another of his apparent mentees filed a civil action against him, Dawn Richard. Dawn Richard is a former member of the girl group Danity Kane, and then she joined a trio group with Combs and another singer, Kalina Harper. It was called Diddy Dirty Money. She filed a lawsuit claiming that Combs sexually and verbally abused her for a decade. She also claimed that Combs owes her more than $3 million in unpaid salary and royalties, as well as unpaid wages for touring. And going back to Usher, Richard claims that Usher witnessed Combs' alleged abuse of his then girlfriend, Cassie Ventura. Ventura had filed her own bombshell lawsuit last fall, seemingly kickstarting Combs' significant legal troubles. In the complaint, Richard's attorneys write, in the weeks and months leading up to the Bad Boy Interscope deal, Mr. Combs had frequent meetings with producer and then CEO of Interscope Records, Jimmy Iovine. On one such occasion, Combs hosted a dinner at a West Hollywood, California restaurant, which Miss Richard and Miss Harper were requested to attend. Among the guests at the dinner were celebrities like Neo and Usher, as well as Mr. Iovine. At the dinner, Mr. Combs and Miss Ventura had an argument. In front of the dinner guests, Mr. Combs hissed at Miss Ventura in a screaming whisper and forcefully punched her in the stomach, causing her to double over in visible pain, crying. Miss Clark escorted Miss Ventura out of the restaurant, and Mr. Combs remained and continued socializing with the dinner guests. At this point, Interscope Records.
The stories reportedly described an atmosphere rather than a single incident, a space where power was absolute and boundaries were unclear, where youth and ambition existed under the shadow of authority that didn't need to explain itself. That kind of imbalance doesn't need violence to be terrifying, it just needs unpredictability. Growing up or coming up in an environment like that teaches people to stay alert, to read moods, to avoid conflict, to internalize discomfort instead of questioning it. Over time, those habits become normal. Normal doesn't mean healthy. The intense reaction came from recognition. Too many people understood the structure being described. Different industry, different setting, same hierarchy, same silence, same expectation that gratitude should outweigh fear. That recognition is unsettling. When hidden stories begin to surface after years of quiet, people always ask why now, but that question misses the point. Silence isn't absence, it's pressure held in place, and pressure eventually finds a crack.
Records clearly had actual knowledge that Combs was dangerous around females and that Combs was willing to brazenly batter a female in public. Erica Wolf, one of Combs' attorneys, responded to the Richards lawsuit with this statement to Vibe. Mr. Combs is shocked and disappointed by this lawsuit. In an attempt to rewrite history, Dawn Richard has now manufactured a series of false claims, all in the hopes of trying to get a payday conveniently timed to coincide with her album release and press tour. So let's go back to Usher. There was speculation around him, and that increased dramatically when all of the singer's tweets suddenly disappeared on the day before Combs was arrested in New York. There were rumors that Usher might be trying to cover up any past mentions of Combs on his feed, but Usher later tweeted, or wrote on X, Account got hacked and damn, y'all ran with it, followed by 3 laughing emojis. His tweets also seem to be restored on his feed. Now, Usher is not the only up-and-coming superstar that got special attention from Combs. There was a video posted to Justin Bieber's YouTube page when the singer was just 15. It's gone viral again after the latest allegations against Combs.
Justin, you ever seen the movie 48 Hours? Right now, he's having 48 hours with Diddy, him and his boy. They're having the times of their lives, like where we hanging out and what we doing. We can't really disclose, but it's definitely a 15-year-old's dream.
Now, Usher was actually the one to introduce Bieber to the world of Combs and Bad Boy Entertainment. Usher told Howard Stern that he'd heard about Bieber through the grapevine, he'd seen some of his YouTube videos, and had his people set up a meeting. And that led Usher to oversee Bieber's debut album, My World. Now, most recently, Suge Knight, the rival of Sean Combs, music executive who's currently sitting in prison after pleading no contest to voluntary manslaughter after running over a man, he spoke in a bombshell interview with Chris Cuomo on News Nation, and one of the things he alleged was that music executives had used alcohol and drugs to compromise Combs' manhood. He told Cuomo that Combs was taught that, and he got Usher as a kid, alcohol, drugs, sex, Justin Bieber, and see, they do these things to take control. Okay, so what are we supposed to do with all of this? Well, let me bring in right now civil rights attorney Joe Richardson to help break this down. Joe, so good to see you. Thank you for coming on. When I mention this, any possible connection with Usher here, anything legally speaking that sticks out to you?
It's not necessarily clear that there is, which Usher can continue to hope for in that regard. However, because they get to cast such a wide net in charging him, they're charging Puff Daddy with a conspiracy. And so as part of that, they can use things that they didn't prosecute because they ran out of time. They didn't prosecute for any of a number of reasons. They can put them all in together and mix them all up, and that gives you your conspiracy. So if Usher witnessed things, and they could go back 20 years, they could go back a long time. If he witnessed things, if he was part of things, all of that can potentially be admissible. And so I see why there was this reaction either by him or his hacker to get rid of some information.
You don't believe it?
Twitter.
You don't believe it?
I don't have to figure that out one way or the other, but the irony is crazy. You know what I mean? His hacker's got good timing. Let me just put it to you that way. He's not the one he wasn't named in the indictment, et cetera.
Right.
But by the way, nobody else was named in the indictment, but it is a conspiracy. And that normally means with or together and others. So he's not totally safe just because.
Distance creates clarity. Time reframes memory. What once felt confusing starts to feel wrong. What once felt unavoidable starts to feel unacceptable. That's usually when people speak. The allegations reportedly didn't frame themselves as attacks. They sounded like recollections, like someone finally putting language to experiences that never sat right but couldn't be named at the time. That matters. Because chilling stories don't always involve obvious threats. Sometimes they involve fear of consequences, fear of being cut off, fear of retaliation, fear of not being believed. Those fears are powerful motivators for silence. The fire intensified because these stories challenged the mythology of mentorship, the idea that opportunity automatically equals protection. That guidance from powerful figures is always benevolent. Reality is more complicated. Opportunity without accountability can become exposure. Mentorship without boundaries can become control. And when youth is involved, the imbalance multiplies. That's where things get dangerous.
Information that there were other individuals that could have possibly observed these alleged assaults or attacks on Ms. Ventura. Not only that, but if the government intends on establishing a timeline or a pattern of events with respect to Mr. Combs, his enterprise, and their dealings with individuals from the public or in the industry, it's good to note that the allegation, or at least the testimony came in, that Usher was involved with Mr. Combs early on in his career when he was approximately, I believe, 14 years of age, that he had gone to some sort of academy through Mr. Combs' enterprise or business. And the government can certainly use that to show a long pattern of behavior, dealings that he may have had with other individuals in the industry, and also to establish that Mr. Combs and Ms. Ventura had this long-standing relationship, that not only, there were a select few that got to observe, but that publicly some of these allegations or allegations of violence happened, and that other people observed those things.
And when we look at the transcript, and I have it here, and you have the defense asking why Richard did not talk previously in conversations with the government about Usher being there, Jimmy Levine, who's a famous producer, as well as the singer Neo. Should we take anything away from that it appeared that their names didn't come up earlier when she was having conversations with the government?
Yeah, what we can take away, and what the defense is essentially trying to do here, is really strike at her credibility. What the defense did during its cross examination is say, well, these other individuals were there and you didn't disclose their names until now. And why was that? If you are participating in a government investigation, you're presumed and you should tell the truth, the whole truth, and the full truth. And you failed to disclose a significant thing, which were the other individuals that were present. You failed to disclose that to the government. And now it's only today, as you're testifying, that we're just now hearing of these other individuals, Usher Raymond, Neo, and other executive producers that were involved or possibly witnesses to the case. Again, striking at her credibility because she did not tell the full truth at the time she was asked by the government, which later down the line during closing arguments, the defense can get up and say, Ms. Richard testified A, B, and C to you. However, she failed to disclose X, Y, and Z, and that's why you shouldn't believe her. That's why you should not give her the credibility that the judge is going to instruct you on, and the jury can take that into consideration.
And one thing that's been apparent throughout all the witnesses thus far is clearly this was a relationship that had a lot of domestic violence incidents, but this isn't a domestic violence case. Yet it seems like there's a lot of people who witnessed physical abuse. And in this case, you have Usher and Neo. I mean, these are A-list celebrities who are seeing Sean Combs punch his girlfriend allegedly in the stomach, which is something that you would think if you saw that, on the outside, if you think you'd stop that, you would step in, you would say something, but apparently they didn't, according to Don Richard's testimony. Does any of that, the fact that he was doing this out in the open, play towards taking some of the domestic violence incidents, but showing that it was a much larger thing, which is what the government's trying to prove?
So with respect to the other individuals being present, although there's an allegation that they were present, and they're not really allegations, it's just background facts. I don't know that Ms. Richard has testified that they actually observed the striking. Maybe they did, maybe they did not. But I don't think that that's going to do any benefit for the government as far as knowing that these things happened more broadly. I mean, it's clear as day that this case is rooted in domestic violence, that Mr. Combs was domestically violent towards Ms. Ventura, whether it was isolated behind closed doors and just Ms. Ventura.
The allegations reportedly suggested that fear wasn't an exception, it was part of the environment. That discomfort was normalized, that questioning authority wasn't encouraged. Those conditions don't foster growth, they foster compliance. The image started to burn because people realized how much of it depended on silence from those who had the least power to speak. When those voices finally emerge, even carefully, the structure holding the image together weakens. Public reactions shifted quickly, loud defenses softened, certainty gave way to caution, language became measured. That change didn't happen by accident. Caution appears when people sense instability. The chilling nature of the stories came from what they implied rather than what they stated outright. Implication is powerful, it invites reflection, it forces listeners to connect dots on their own. And once people start connecting dots, narratives lose control. The hidden stories reportedly weren't shared for spectacle, they didn't come with demands, they didn't come with ultimatums, they existed as
and they're a close select few were testifying to this, or on a grander scale where, a select few and publicly people can testify or people have observed these allegations, whether it was just one or whether it was many. Testimony is evidence, and whether that was testimony from one person or testimony from multiple people, the jury can still consider that as evidence in determining whether Mr. Combs is guilty or not guilty. If these individuals observe that, then, the hope would be that someone would have intervened earlier on. But again, it doesn't negate the fact that, the charges here are racketeering, sex trafficking, and things of that nature. One of the things the government is alleging is the use of force. So I think that's why we continue to hear this domestically violent line of questioning. And I think the government is hoping that the jurors will view this as satisfactory to the element requiring or requiring force, physical force of violence.
Yeah, and to your point, I'll just looking at this transcript, you're right. Yeah, it's Usher was there, Jimmy Levine was there, Neo came through. So it's saying that they were there, not necessarily that they witnessed the abuse that Dawn Richard said happened at this dinner. What did you make of her testimony now that she's off the stand?
It was pretty interesting testimony. I don't know that she was a necessary witness, although the government deemed her to be necessary. Miss Ventura got on the stand and testified about the abuse. It testified about what happened to her. Miss Richard seemingly came up behind her and corroborated for the government those allegations. And I don't think there was even a question about that. The hotel footage came into evidence. Ms. Ventura testified, so now Ms. Richard is here testifying to more allegations of domestic violence. And the government has to be really careful here, because the way that it is being painted at this point is that this is a domestically violent case, which is true. But the government needs to prove a RICO. They need to prove sex trafficking. They don't need to prove domestic violence, and it can certainly confuse the issues with the jury and ultimately land them in a verdict of not guilty.
I know some of the evidence that the government will point to, some of frequent flyer accounts, credit cards, bank accounts. We haven't really heard a lot about that as of yet. How do you see the government, now that they've really established, whether it's Cassie's testimony, some things that Dawn Richard has said about the domestic abuse, the violence that was in this relationship, where do they go from here if they are going to paint this picture of a RICO, which is essentially what they need to do in this trial if they want to get a conviction?
Yeah, so what the government's going to continue to do is put on their witnesses. I think that they got a witness on the stand that worked for Mr. Combs at a certain point in time. That individual also testified to some alleged violent behavior on behalf of Mr. Combs. I think if this individual is still testifying, or as other individuals continue to testify, we will start to hear about transportation with regard to these alleged sex workers. So one of the things that the government has to prove and show is that there was a transportation via interstate commerce, which is a very wide net and catch-all for the government in order to seek a conviction, is that these individuals were transported or traveled via interstate commerce from one state to another. So we may hear testimony about frequent flyer accounts, or whoever the individual was that set up these or purchased these plane tickets, or if they flew private. Whoever set up the transportation and travel may ultimately testify. We might hear from them to further establish that this was a sex trafficking case.
And on the interstate commerce charge, if they were to buy an escort from Miami and fly them to New York, would that be considered interstate commerce?
That would be. So the train, or excuse me, not the train, the plane traveling from Miami to New York.
Testimony, not legal, but emotional. Emotional truth has weight. It lingers longer than headlines. It reshapes how people interpret past behavior. It changes how future claims are received. The fire burned hotter because this wasn't an isolated account dropped into a vacuum. It landed in a cultural moment where people are less willing to excuse power without accountability, less willing to dismiss discomfort as the cost of success. Context matters. People are tired of discovering harm only after decades of silence. They're tired of realizing too late that fear was mistaken for discipline and control was mistaken for leadership. That fatigue fueled the reaction. The allegations reportedly highlighted how easily young people can be trapped between ambition and safety, how speaking up can feel like self-destruction when the person you're speaking about controls access, opportunity, and reputation. That trap is real. And once someone escapes it enough to speak, the reaction is never neutral. The image burned because it was built on certainty, on the idea that everything was known, understood, handled. Hidden stories introduce uncertainty, and uncertainty is poison to image. People don't know what to do with uncertainty, so they pause.
Is an indication that this was via interstate commerce because it's going from one state to another. Even if they traveled via train or via car, going across state lines would satisfy that factor.
We've seen Cassie's off the stand, but whether it's Don Richard's testimony, David James, who's the former personal assistant, he's talked about Cassie as well. What do you make at this point, seeing how the testimony's going, that the government decided to have Cassie early on in this trial as opposed to building up to her testimony at the end?
You know, I'm always in favor, as a former prosecutor, I'm always in favor of putting my victim on last if I can, because her words will echo to the jury indefinitely. You know, yes, she could have testified early, and people will tend to remember what they've heard early on and later in the game. But I think here it's really impactful to build up the puzzle, these other individuals who were involved, and ultimately get us to Miss Ventura, who, you know, will testify as to what specifically happened. And the jury is going to be more likely to remember her testimony, especially compelling testimony, if she is the last and key witness. And there would have been a buildup that the government would have made to her testimony. Now, it doesn't mean that they can't come back guilty, because she did testify early on, and now these individuals that are testifying are further establishing what happened. That's just a personal preference and what the government ultimately deemed as the best way to, you know, put their witnesses on. And also, Miss Ventura is pregnant, heavily pregnant. They didn't want to run the risk of her going into labor later on during the trial and not being able to be present to testify. So I think that they did have to get her out of the way early. My preference just would have been to put her on later if I was the prosecutor on the case.
We've seen a couple cross-examinations from Sean Combs' defense team. How would you say they're doing thus far?
I think they're doing a great job. I think that the defense is eliciting facts or alleged facts that the prosecution has kept out so far. And one of the things that we always discuss, you know, in trial practice is you never want the jury to find something out from the other side. If you have bad facts for your case, you want to get them out there and do away with it, and show them it's not a big deal. Yes, she may not have disclosed certain information previously, and I can explain later as to why, but you really want to get those bad facts out of the way. And I think that at least some of the testimony that I've seen or heard is that, you know, when these when the prosecution witnesses are testifying under cross-examination, the defense is getting out facts that really kind of hurt the prosecution. I think that with Ms. Richard's testimony, she testified that, you know, she had been working with Mr. Combs, that she observed these allegations of violence and things of that nature. But then later down the line, she goes to work for him and works in a musical group with him and another individual. We didn't hear that under the direct examination. We heard that under cross-examination. And I think that those are the things that the government needs to be mindful of, because they do seem to be surprising facts as the defense brings them out during cross-examination. And they don't want to turn the jury off, and they don't want to hide anything from the jury.
And with some of these big celebrity names that have come up, Kid Cudi, the rapper who I'm forgetting his real name right now, but he dated Cassie for a bit. His name was brought up. Usher and Neo are brought up yesterday. How likely is it any of these figures?
They watch. They reassess. That pauses the fire. The chilling aspect also came from the long timeline. Years of silence don't suggest fabrication. They suggest fear, confusion, loyalty, and survival strategies layered on top of each other. Silence that long changes a person. When that silence finally breaks, it rarely sounds angry, it sounds tired. That tiredness came through. The stories reportedly didn't ask people to cancel, destroy, or erase anything. They asked to be acknowledged, and acknowledgement alone was enough to destabilize the narrative. Because once acknowledgement exists, denial feels forced. The fire intensified as people revisited old moments with new awareness. Past confidence felt more rigid, past control felt heavier, past authority felt less admirable. Reinterpretation is unavoidable once new context exists. And context is irreversible. The chilling stories didn't need proof in the moment to have impact. They didn't need confirmation to matter. Their existence alone altered perception. That's the power of breaking silence. The hidden stories reportedly revealed how systems protect themselves, how silence is rewarded, how fear is reframed as respect, how questioning power is treated as betrayal. Those systems don't collapse easily, but they do crack when light gets in. The image is under fire because fire exposes structure. It shows what's solid and what was only surface level. What remains after that exposure isn't clarity yet. It's tension, waiting, uncertainty. And uncertainty is uncomfortable. This moment didn't explode because it wasn't about shock. It burned because it was about recognition, about patterns people have seen before and wish they hadn't ignored. Once those patterns are named, even indirectly, they can't be unseen. The fire won't disappear just because attention moves on. Fires like this smolder, they reshape ground slowly. And whether more stories emerge or not, the damage is already done. Not because of what people believe, but because of what they now consider possible. Hidden stories don't need to be loud to be chilling. Sometimes the quietest revelations burn the longest.